Welcome to session 2 of our introductory course on capitalism in the age of COVID. And this is a course which is looking at thinking about capitalism, the general experience of capitalism, but also particularly, what it's like to experience it in 2020 and how it affects all our experience of everything else that's going on. So I'll just briefly define what I mean by capitalism, which I think I'm going to do every time. And my general understanding of that term is something initially quite simple, which is just capitalism is basically the practice of trying to accumulate huge amounts of profit. And then a sort of, in a broader terms, it is any kind of, when we talk about being in a capitalist society or capitalist social relations, we're talking about things being organized in a way in which that is the overriding objective of almost all the social activity we're engaged in. So, whether we're making videos or we're studying at university or we're helping people in a hospital, ultimately everything is supposed to be justified with reference to whether it makes somebody rich or not. And that's the sort of defining feature of living in a capitalist society. And specifically today, we're going to talk about the relationship with between capitalism and racism and issues of race and the way in which we experience, racial difference and racial sort of power relations. So to that end, we've invited Adam Elliott-Cooper, a friend of mine and a colleague, on to talk about it. And I think I should say, to kick off, just to be clear about where we're coming from. That personally, I'm against the racism. I think it's bad. So, and I presume you're coming from the same place on that issue.
Also critical race. Yeah.
So we're going to be biased from the start in assuming racism is bad. I think I want to start off before we talk about these very general issues, and more abstract issues about the relationship between capitalism and racism. Talk about one of the issues of the experience of the pandemic that's obviously been arguably surprising to a lot of people and quite central, which is the fact that certainly here and in the US, I haven't really monitored that situation elsewhere. People of color have been affected noticeably, demonstrably worse than other groups of people. Now, why is that, do you think, Adam?
I think that the pandemic has illustrated a number of the kinds of inequalities that already existed within our society, but maybe revealed them in a more visible way for a lot of people. And so I think there are a number of complex reasons why people of colour have been more likely to be infected or die from COVID-19. I think one of them, of course, is the fact that many people who are people of colour work in frontline services, work in social care, in healthcare, work in maybe taxi services or other retail services. A number of different jobs where they like to come into contact with other members of the public or indeed people who have already been infected. But of course, the other reason is related to other kind of social issues that relate to racial inequalities, things relating to housing and access to healthcare, where people from racially minoritized groups are again more likely to have to live in substandard or overcrowded housing, or not have access to GPs or other healthcare facilities for a range of different reasons relating to racial inequality as well. So I think there's probably a number of different reasons why people from racially minoritized groups have been adversely affected by this pandemic. And I think it goes beyond inequalities in healthcare and speaks to questions relating to the economy and work and society and more generally as well.
So what you've touched on there, and you've used this phrase racially minoritized group several times, so we should probably unpack that. I mean, that implies that's a phrase which is making clear that the very fact that we're used to talking about black and ethnic minority people or ethnic or racial minorities, and of course, but that term is making clear that actually even defining someone as in a minority is actually is a political act in a way, or it's a classificatory act. Black people aren't in a minority everywhere. Asian people are definitely not in a minority everywhere. So, on a planetary scale, everywhere we're all, we're both ethnic minorities, if that's the classification you want to use. So I think it's important to make that clear to people and that's something we're going to think about, is the way in which, people are, racial categories are not sort of natural, they're not organic, they don't just exist in the world. But we'll sort of come back to that history, I think. And also it seems like, well, one of the things implicitly you've touched on there is the relationship between race and class, and the fact that, well, you know, there's a complex relationship between the way in which people that were defined as belonging to certain ethnic groups actually experience poverty, and the fact that, and this is a big debate in left theory and left strategy. Well, I mean, you know, there's an extreme position which says, well, actually, there's not really any such thing as race at all. We shouldn't really talk about it. Even talking about it sort of makes it exist. Whereas in fact, we should only focus on the fact that what affects people's life chances, their quality of life, is whether they're poor or rich, you know, what their class status is, and that actually we shouldn't even think about race at all as a separate issue. I mean, there's people like, I mean, effectively that's the position taken by people like Adolph Reed in the United States at the moment. So, I mean, where do you come down on that issue?
So I think the main critique of that kind of what we might call vulgar Marxism comes from a tradition which we might call Black Marxism, which wasn't founded but was probably most well known through the work of Cedric Robinson, who died a few years ago. And what Cedric Robinson argues is that rather than capitalism slowly proletarianizing more people, which basically means it slowly incorporates more and more people into its workforces, which makes us more and more similar. In fact, what he argues is that racial capitalism actually differentiates people. It makes people different. And it does this, one of the ways in which it does this anyway, is through racial classifications. So rather than race being an identity, you know, one day everyone in Africa decided they were black, what actually happens is capitalism expands from Europe through imperialism, goes to places like the Americas, Africa, and categorizes different groups of people that live there. And through those categories, they're able to more effectively control, more effectively coerce, more effectively exploit, and very often enact violence and kill these different categories of people, which we now call races. And so that's why I use the phrase racially minoritized, because people aren't naturally racial minorities. They are made into minorities by the social, political, and economic system in which we live in order to more effectively exploit, control, and enact violence upon them.
I mean, when we're talking about race, arguably, we can argue about this, but it's not the subject today. Arguably, there's a difference from talking about, say, you know, sexuality or gender, and that, you know, there's a whole debate over to what extent sexuality or gender has any biological reality, but there are very obvious reasons why some people think it does. Whereas race just doesn't have any biological status. I mean, the concept of race as it was sort of came to be used from the 17th, 18th century onwards, and as people still use it today, sort of implied that, well, there's some relationship between people's behavior or their personality or their capacities, which is related to, you know, whether they look more like you or more like me. And we just know now from the genetic science it's nonsense, that there's no more correlation between those things and just different hair colours that white people have or whatever. So race just doesn't exist in a biological sense. And on some level, the basic idea of racism is just, oh, there are these sets of people called races, and, you know, that are sort of, you know, different species of human, which is just scientifically we know is nonsense. On the other hand, the fact that from about the 16th, 17th century onward, or really from the end of the 15th century, people from Europe went out around the world taking other people's land, making people slaves, and justifying it on the basis of this story they told themselves and other people, which said, well, it's okay for us to do this because these people are a different race to us. That's produced a situation in which the lived people's actual lives are defined by whether they're categorized according to these racial groups or not. So race becomes a sort of social reality and a historical reality, even though it's never a biological reality.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in a very crude way, I guess it's easy for people to think that race is biological, because they'll say, well, if two black people have a child, that child will be black. If two white people have a child, that child will be white. So, of course, race is biological. But, of course, what we consider to be a racial category shifts and changes in different contexts. So, for instance, an example I always tell my students is the example of Barack Obama. Barack Obama is African-American in the United States, but would be racialized as a colored in South Africa, but would be racialized as one of the many derivations of brown if he lived in Brazil, would be a red man in Jamaica, would be this thing we have in Britain called mixed race if he lived in Britain, and would be racialized as a Mzungu or white if he lived in Kenya, where his dad's from. Barack Obama's biology doesn't change when he moves from social context to social context, but the way in which race is socially constructed changes in all of these different contexts. And that's why we have to understand race as being something which is a social construct, or more accurately, a colonial construct, rather than something which is scientific.
I mean, really, the course is spoken about capitalism, and capitalism as we know it is generally thought to have begun really in what historians call the early modern period, like maybe the 17th century, maybe a bit earlier, which is basically the first time when you get a situation where there's enough opportunity for rich traders, merchants, employers of other people's labor to accumulate fortunes on a scale which enable them to really, to challenge the power and authority, say, of kings or, great landowners or what have you. And it's and an important point there is that history really begins with the history of colonialism. It begins with people going out from Europe and basically just taking the land, the resources, and the enslaved bodies of people in these other parts of the world. And because this is a bit theoretical, but one of the theoretical questions which is always we're thinking about is the question of whether living in a capitalist society like the society we live in today necessarily produces racism. And you can make an argument, well, there are black capitalists, there are white exploited people that obviously on a certain level, not just capitalism, but the whole political philosophy of what we call liberalism, which is really the dominant way of thinking about the world in most capitalist societies, which says that, well, basically everybody is an individual competing with other individuals, and the job of a government is to make sure that everybody can do that sort of fairly. All of that ought to, because it ought to promote the idea that everybody should just be judged as an individual or treated as an individual and allowed to compete with others as an individual. It ought to be sort of race blind. It ought to promote a culture and a society in which, people are not judged according to the color of their skin. And in theory, that might be possible. But historically, the historical reality is, this is how I always put it anyway, you can tell me if you think this is right or wrong, is, well, historically, we don't know if that's possible because it's never happened, because that is not how actual capitalism came into existence. Actual capitalism came into existence when a load of white people, or people who would end up being categorizing themselves as white, went out from Europe and stole a load of other people's land. That's how it started. And and to some extent, and that history has continued to mark our experience of it ever since. Do you agree with that?
I think broadly speaking, that's generally correct. And I think this relationship between race and, I think it's interesting that you mentioned this point about, there are black capitalists. So how can we have this thing called racial capitalism? How can capitalism reproduce racism if there's lots of wealthy people of color across the global south? And so I think it's important for us to think about the ways in which racism is not a mathematical science. It doesn't create very clear, well-trodden, easily identifiable boundaries between the powerful group of people and the oppressed group of people. It's far more slippery. And that's one of the things that makes it so powerful. So while we can look back at chattel slavery in the Americas and, be very clear, oh, look, the black people are enslaved, the indigenous people are being exterminated, the white people are the settlers and the colonizers, that's clearly racism. What we have today, I think, is in many ways a far more sophisticated form of racism, what we might call a form of racism which is able to adapt to the demands of modern liberalism, the demands of modernity, which say that, as you mentioned, people should be judged upon their merit, and we should live in a meritocracy where working hard provides you with material gain and wealth. And so, in order for capitalism to survive, in order for capitalism to thrive in a world in which these kinds of ideals proliferate and become popular, it's been able to shift and merge with these ideals in order to produce rather than a colonial situation across Africa and parts of Asia, where white people are actually extracting wealth from the subjugated populations there. Instead, you have dictators or people in positions of government across the global south who often work in line with multinational corporations or Western governments and other capitalist interests, which still reproduce a form of racial capitalism. So we still see the underdevelopment of the global south and the overdevelopment of the global north. We still see racial capitalism through the hyper exploitation of workers in the global south and the relatively less exploitative forms of work in wealthier, higher income nations in the global north. So we still see those patterns being reproduced, but never through very clear-cut, easily identifiable mathematical, scientific lines. It's something social, therefore it's something far slippery and messier and harder to pin down.
Right, yeah. And of course, historically as well, we see that kind of differentiation within populations being one of the key mechanisms, even in the global north, even in the sort of quote unquote highly developed capitalist economies, one of the ways by which communities have been divided from each other, and really the possibility of working people developing relations of solidarity and challenging the authority of capitalists has been limited. I mean, I would go so far as to say you go right back to the 19th century. I mean, you referred to the idea of proletarianization earlier. That's the proletariat in Marx's terms is the working class as we defined it in the last session. Actually, it's everybody who has to sell their labour to live. And one of the things that Marx thought was going to happen, he thought capitalist society would sort of proletarianize, as we put it, everybody. He thought everybody would, almost everyone, a tiny minority of capitalists would end up with all the money, and everybody else would end up just having to sell their labor and feeling exploited. And I mean, on a certain level, in certain ways that's true. You can look at professions like the teaching profession, and sociologists will say, well, actually, teachers thought of themselves as this privileged group who was sort of part of the middle class and almost closer to the sort of capitalist class at one time in history, and now, which I don't think is really true, but that's another argument. And now now they're in unions and they recognise themselves as exploited workers and they become sort of proletarianised. And that's all true, sort of true. But one of the other things that's happened, which isn't exactly what Marx thought was going to happen in the 20th century, is that there's been these all kinds of proliferating differences between people produced. And so that we think of ourselves as, I'm a hipster who lives in, East London, drinks, cappuccinos, or I'm a quote unquote working class beer person, in a northern town who, drinks beer, and actually they're earning the same money. They might even be working for the same company. And this makes it very difficult for people to kind of recognize their potential common interest. But the most frequently used mechanism to divide people, going right back to the 19th century, is racism. I mean, back in 19th century London, Marx said, well, the thing which is really preventing a working class movement from emerging is anti-Irish racism amongst English workers, and anti-black racism has just been used again and again, especially in the United States, to really basically to say to white workers who are poor and exploited themselves, you might be sort of poor and exploited, but you're better off than those black people, so you should be happy.
W.E. Du Bois, a famous African-American sociologist, talks about this in his thesis, The Wages of Whiteness, and about how whiteness provides this immaterial wage for people racialized as whites, even if their actual material lives are far more similar with other working-class black people than they are with wealthier white people. But I think it's important for us also to connect the ways in which racism is used to divide oppressed people and the way in which racism is used to try to thwart attempts at solidarity, and connect that to the ways in which racism is fundamental in a number of different ways as well that we've already touched upon. The ways in which racism can be used and racial categories can be used to identify some people as undeserving of freedoms and civil liberties. The way that racism can be used to identify certain people as being morally degenerate, as violent, as criminal, and therefore in need of more harsh forms of state discipline and other forms of structural violence. And so racism plays so many different important roles in not simply dividing people, but controlling and coercing and exploiting them, that it's become almost fundamental to the functioning of capitalism itself. And I guess one more thing that's important is that one of the other ways in which racism is linked to class is through the ways in which new forms of exploitation, new forms of control, new forms of violence are often introduced through racism. So, for instance, the expansion of Britain's prison system, right? Britain's prison system has almost doubled since the early 1980s. And one of the ways in which the state has been able to justify this massive expansion in the prison system is through the idea that there are new forms of crime, there are new forms of criminality that are more violent, more deviant, more immoral, and more dangerous than anything Britain has ever seen before. And racism is a really important way for them to be able to do this. If people are watching, just think about what pops into your head when you hear the word terrorist or gangster or crime, right? But of course, despite the fact that our prison system has doubled over the last, almost doubled anyway, over the last 40 years, and racism has been a really fundamental justification for that expansion, the majority of people who are imprisoned are working class white people, are lower income people who are white. So whilst racism is really fundamental for creating the environment in which the states can use new forms of exploitation and control and violence, racialized minorities who are the targets of this racism are not the only people who are affected by it, even if they are disproportionately affected. It ends up being used against a whole swathe of oppressed groups of people.
I think everybody will probably understand the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a movement that begins in the United States, which is a protest movement against the very obvious violent racism of the police. Although people tend to think that policing is just a sort of something any modern society will do in order to prevent crime or to protect property. Again, the actual truth is the actual history of modern policing is really linked to the history of, wealthy population, wealthy groups trying to control poor groups, and most of a lot of the techniques and systems of modern policing were actually developed in the colonies, weren't they? They were developed, in order to subjugate non-white populations of people who were being effectively enslaved. That's right.
Yeah. So on the one hand, certainly most of British policing historically hasn't taken place on the British mainland. It's taken place in Britain's colonies, and I think thinking about that colonial policing is really helpful because in the colonies there was no distinction between the military and the police. So while we consider there to be this militarization of the police taking place over the last 30 or 40 years here on the British mainland, what I think we're actually seeing British policing becoming more akin to what British policing has been like in many of its colonies. So you see this, of course, in the roots of British policing, which where the first kind of bobbies, Robert Peel, who first founded many of the police forces in Britain's colony of Ireland. But many of the different kinds of tactics and logics of policing actually emerge in the colonial situation, whether it be Kenya, Malaya, what's now Yemen, and what's now Sri Lanka, Palestine, and elsewhere.
Okay, great. And so with reference to this specifically to the sort of explosion of activism around Black Lives Matter this summer, like why do you think it happened this summer? And was it related to the pandemic or was it despite the pandemic?
I think there are probably I'm sure there are many reasons, but I'd say the 3 or 4 for me key reasons are, firstly, of course, I think a lot of people are very angry about the pandemic, about the way in which it's been handled, or better mishandled, I would say, by governments both in the United States and here in Britain, but other countries as well. I think the second thing, of course, is the fact that the governments that we have here in Britain and in the United States are far more nationalist, right-wing, and in many ways overtly racist and bigoted today in comparison to the last wave of Black Lives Matter protests that we saw in 2014 and 2015. And so I think, again, people are angry not simply at policing, but are angry at the political situation in which we've seen. And I think it's worth restating that these are the largest anti-racist protests in British history ever. And we've seen protests not just in large cities across the country, but also in small towns and villages in relatively rural and not very multicultural areas. And I think for me, what that's about is about not people. This is about people not saying, we're sick and tired of the police racism and harassment that we see every single day, because it's unlikely that they see it. But I think what they are saying is that this political culture that we're supposed to be the constituents of, this nationalism, this more naked form of racism, this kind of xenophobia, isn't something we want to be a part of. And so I think it also speaks to that wider political context of nationalism, which has been popularized in recent years. And I think the third thing, of course, is the visibility of these particular instances of police violence. The fact that people are watching this footage of people not simply being killed in broad daylight, but effectively being tortured to death on a public street. And I think the human response to seeing another human being being treated in that way is anger and rage, and as we've seen, collective resistance.
Moving on from BLM and thinking about the history of the historic history of forms of anti-racist politics, what can we do about it? What do we do to challenge racial capitalism?
So one of the main demands of this Black Lives Matter movement has been around defunding the police or police abolition. And that's quite a scary concept for a lot of people, right? So what does that possibly mean? So what the movement is effectively arguing is that the police and prison system has been continually expanding for a very long time, at least half a century, here in Britain. But we haven't seen any improvements in public safety. We haven't seen any harm reduction. And what they argue is that actually the police aren't effective at all in making our communities safer or providing us with any reduction in harm within our lives. And in fact, what we should be thinking about are more preventative measures and dealing with the problems that lead to people coming into contact with the criminal justice system. So what they're arguing for is for community-led mental health services, for better and affordable council housing, for well-paid, secure and unionized jobs, for a humane border system, i.e. getting rid or significantly eroding the power of our border regime, improving people's access to healthcare and social care and youth services. All of these types of things can help the most vulnerable people in our society before they come into contact with the criminal justice system. Because if we look at our prison system, we see a massive overrepresentation of people who've experienced domestic violence or child abuse, have experienced homelessness or poverty, have experienced unemployment or school exclusion, have special educational needs or experienced mental health problems. All of these types of problems can be addressed without the use of the police and prison system if we make the kinds of community-led social investments that enable those vulnerable people to live far better, far more fulfilled and less oppressed and harm-filled lives. And so whilst we see that these protests are on the surface a form of resistance and reaction to police racism, what the demands is a radical reimagining of a world in which we don't rely on state violence to try to solve some of our most serious social problems. And in doing that, what that vision argues for isn't, importantly, the end of all police and prison systems tomorrow, but an erosion of our reliance on the power and resources of the police and prison system, and the investment and the empowerment of community-led solutions to the kinds of social problems that lead to people coming into contact with the criminal justice system. And I guess the final thing is that this radical vision, therefore, isn't just about racism. It's about racial capitalism. And therefore, it's a vision which uses racism, sees what racism does, but then envisages a world which isn't simply free from racism, but begins to erode all forms of exploitation and violence.
Okay, thanks, Adam. That was brilliant. And If you're watching this before September the 9th, then join me. We'll be having a Zoom call to discuss these issues on September the 9th at 6:00. And the next video in this series will be talking about to Jacob Mukherjee about why the rent is so high.